Well, as the death toll from Japan's catastrophic quake and tsunami mounts, and the Bank of Japan pumps billions into the economy to stabilise it, I'd like to get reaction and insight from my next guest, Niall Ferguson, the Harvard Professor of Economics History. His latest history book called Civilization, the West and the Rest. Now, looking at what happened in the West, not dealing actually with earthquakes, but obviously if we look at what's happened in Japan at the moment, we can see how quickly what did look to be an economic recovery can be derailed by natural events.
That's right. Well, my last book, The Ascent of Money, did in fact talk about the 1923 Japanese earthquake, which devastated Japan's financial system because it pretty much blew apart the insurance sector. If you go back through history, major natural disasters have been disrupting economic development since, I don't know, Lisbon in the time of Voltaire. And it's a reminder, and this is one of the central themes of Civilization, that history isn't about smooth lines and projections that follow nice curves. On the contrary, it's very non-linear, and every now and then a black swan will fly across your screen and radically alter the value of your portfolio. It's a classic illustration.
And do you think that this could be one of those events?
Well, there's no question that if you put it together with the revolution stroke civil war in North Africa and the Middle East, we are entering some pretty choppy water, not only geopolitically, not only in terms of the entire nuclear energy sector, but I think fiscally, because the implications for Japan's budget, as you were just discussing in your last item, can only be bad, at least in the short term. And although it's conventional to say, yes, but there'll be a great GDP boom afterwards as they reconstruct, my sense is that right now people are underestimating the magnitude of what's just happened, and I think it is worse than Kobe. And I think in that sense, when you start to add that together with what is going on in the rest of the world, it adds up to me to not only fiscal problems, but potentially inflation problems. I think the world is moving from a deflationary mindset, which was really post-2007, 2008, post-Lehman Brothers, into a new inflationary mindset. And I think the combination of major geopolitical risk in North Africa, Middle East, plus this new huge shock from Japan, third largest economy in the world, that is a pretty potent combination.
When you put commodities into that as well, you actually do look for inflationary pressure.
I think it was there already because, of course, the soaring growth of the newer entrants in the Asian economic stakes, combined with some real capacity constraints, not just in oil, we know about that, but through a whole range of commodities. That seems to me a really important side issue here. This is very damaging for the credibility of nuclear energy, although it probably shouldn't be. I mean, in some ways, the impressive thing is that despite the magnitude of the earthquake and the enormous tsunami, these reactors are not going to be Chernobyl-like. I mean, that's highly unlikely at this point. But nevertheless, what you see in the markets, what you see among the politicians is a fresh wave of fear about nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is the best solution to the problem of our dependence on fossil fuels.
It does raise this question about nuclear energy. We've already heard Angela Merkel talking about the life of nuclear plants in Germany, issues about nuclear facilities in San Francisco, and this comes on the back of a week ago when we were seeing oil at record highs. So there really is an energy issue as well that's bringing both what's happening in North Africa and Japan together.
That's right, and although the only piece of good news is that natural gas turns out to be much more plentiful than anybody had thought, that is really scant comfort, because I think the situation in the Middle East is getting worse, not better. And indeed, one of the problems we have here is our myopia. In the sense that the media has switched their attention entirely 180 degrees away from what's happening in Libya, away from what's happening in Egypt. I think what is happening in North Africa and the Middle East is going to get worse, and I think it's going to produce more upheaval, potentially even full-blown war. So we're focusing right now, because of the way that the news industry works, on Japan. Meanwhile, the real driver of the high oil prices is the deteriorating situation in North Africa and the Middle East.
Indeed. And here on The Last Word, we are going to be covering Bahrain and Libya just a little bit later on. I'd like you to stay with me because we're also looking at a very busy day in Europe as well. Europe looks to stem the sovereign debt crisis. Niall Ferguson, Professor of Economic History at Harvard University, is still with me. Looking at the bigger picture here, there is quite a lot to do. Is it possible that next week we're going to see some kind of solution, or like Europe very often does, are we going to have a fudge here?
Well, I'm a little sceptical about what is being done because all along the European leaders have been ducking the key issue, and the key issue is that there are banks in various parts of the European Union that are chronically undercapitalized, maybe even insolvent. Rather than deal with that issue, beginning with Ireland, government after government decided to make it a problem of public finance. That is really the heart of the issue in Europe today. And we continue to discuss this as if it's a sovereign debt crisis, whereas it's really a banking crisis. And one of the biggest ironies in all of this is that the banking crisis extends to Germany. The Germans have set themselves up as the guardians of moral rectitude here, and they've been reading great lectures to the Greeks and others about their improvident behavior. But in truth, the German Landesbanken are one of the major epicenters of this crisis. And until I hear a German politician, and it would be nice if it were Angela Merkel, talking candidly to German voters about Germany's share in this crisis, I'm not really going to believe that a solution is being found. To my mind, the EFSF is just a Ponzi scheme in which governments that are already in the red pledge to get even deeper into the red to bail out those of their number that have lost credibility in the bond market. There's a row of countries waiting to lose credibility in the bond market right now, and I'm not convinced that this is anything other than a very temporary stopgap. When you go back and look at the numbers, the problem is still there, and it's on bank balance sheets.
So if you follow what you're saying to its conclusion, though, you're going to get at some point there is going to be a meltdown. That Ponzi scheme is going to collapse. Well,
that's the worry, that in the end, by consistently fudging the issue, the European leaders are creating a situation in which the bond market does its usual, which is to say, oh, they've solved the problem, that's fine, relax, and the yields come down, and then they say, oh, wait a second, they haven't really solved the problem, and the yields go back up. You know, you only need some bad news about a financial institution in the Iberian space, could be a Spanish caja, for everybody to decide after all the crisis is for real. So I think this is a temporary stay of execution, and until the European leaders get serious about the nature of the crisis they face, we still run the risk of what I would call the European Lehman. After all, Europe had as big a banking problem as the United States when this all kicked off in 2007, but they've never really grappled with it the way the United States did relatively early on in the game.
We were just talking about the fact that when a crisis on the momentous scale of the events that happened in Japan takes hold of the headlines, the huge and historic and life-changing events in North Africa have kind of slipped away. And yet, of course, they are still there. And what's happened in Bahrain today with foreign troops coming in on a different day would be the headline.
That's right. And we have to be very careful of taking our eyes off what is a revolutionary situation in an entire region, and one of huge strategical importance. It's a bit like if there had been an earthquake on July the 13th, 1789, the world's press would have turned away from the French Revolution just as it was really getting going. Revolutions take a while to happen. They're like financial crises. They play out over years, and our attention span, of course, is measurable in minutes. So I think the danger is right now that we turn our attention away from what is rapidly turning into a very, very troubling situation. Now, when I think about this, when I first started to think about this seriously at the early stage of the Egyptian crisis, my first thought was, is this an opportunity for radical Islam, whether in the form of Al-Qaeda, or in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, or in the form of the state of Iran? Now, the Iranians clearly intend to try to exploit the trouble in Bahrain, and that is something about which many other players in the region are deeply worried. If I had to make a prediction about what could happen in the region, I would say there are three troubling scenarios. One, a reimposition of the old order, not only in Libya, but also in Egypt. Two, potential victory for radical Islamists, whether by violence or through elections. And three, full-scale war as the Iranians bid for hegemony in the region. Imagine all this unfolding, and we are sitting watching endless loops of tsunami waters. I mean, they're pretty compelling pictures, those pictures from Japan, but other stuff is going on that may actually have as big, if not a bigger, economic impact.
When you look at the countries that are involved, you talked about Egypt, where things are far from sorted, Libya in effectively in a civil war. We've got the events in Bahrain, we've had Tunisia. Do you see other countries also being affected by this?
Well, let's think of Iraq. If you were running Iranian foreign policy, your best hope would be to disrupt Iraq so seriously that it actually falls apart as a country, and you get some of the oil-rich territory. But there's Saudi too, and although the Day of Rage turned out to be the biggest anticlimax of the past 12 months,
it did show a lot of repression though on the part of those in charge.
Guess what? If the police outnumber demonstrators 10 to 1, there's not going to be a revolution. But I think there's a great deal of unease in Saudi itself, and let's face it, feudal monarchies don't last forever. That's why there aren't many of them left.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We really appreciate all your insights
Andrea.
today. Thanks.